My name is Olivia Reed. I am 31 years old. I remember the exact moment my father handed my grandmother's ring to my stepsister Haley. It was Christmas Eve, 4 years ago. The whole family was gathered around the tree. Haley's always been more sentimental, my father said, placing the small velvet box in her hands. She'll appreciate this the way it deserves. Haley opened the box, gasped, and immediately started crying happy tears. My stepmother hugged her. My father beamed. I sat there, holding my coffee mug, saying nothing. That ring had belonged to my grandmother, my mother's mother. She had given it to my father to pass down to me, specifically, before she died when I was 19. I remembered her exact words, "This goes to Olivia. She'll understand what it means." Apparently, my father had a different plan. I didn't say anything that night. I just smiled, congratulated Haley, and drove home in silence. Let me back up. My parents divorced when I was 8. My father remarried 3 years later, to a woman named Denise, who came with a daughter, Haley, 1 year younger than me. From the beginning, there was an unspoken hierarchy in that house. Haley was a new chapter. I was a reminder of the marriage that hadn't worked. Nobody said this directly, but I felt it in 1,000 small ways. Haley got new clothes for school. I wore hand-me-downs from cousins. Haley's report cards went on the refrigerator. Mine went into a drawer. When Haley struggled socially, my father spent weekends coaching her through it. When I struggled, I was told to toughen up. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was the one person who never made me feel like an afterthought. She lived 2 hours away, and I spent every summer with her as a kid. She taught me to garden, to bake bread, to sew buttons back onto shirts. She used to say I reminded her of herself at that age, quiet, watchful, capable of more than people gave me credit for. The ring had been hers. A modest-looking antique piece, gold with a cluster of small diamonds, passed down from her own mother. She wore it every day of my childhood. When she got sick, during my sophomore year of college, I drove up every weekend to see her. Haley visited twice in 6 months. Near the end, my grandmother pulled me aside during one of my visits. She took the ring off her finger and pressed it into my palm. "I want your father to give this to you when I'm gone," she said. "Not right away. When you're older. But it's yours, Olivia. It always has been." She passed away 2 months later. My father took the ring for safekeeping, saying it wasn't the right time to give it to me yet. I was still in college, still figuring things out. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? 9 years passed. I graduated, built a career in marketing, got promoted twice, bought my own condo. I never brought up the ring. I assumed, foolishly, that it was simply waiting for the right moment. The right moment, apparently, was Haley's engagement. That Christmas Eve, my father gave away the ring my grandmother had specifically, explicitly, personally given to me, to the stepdaughter who had visited her exactly twice while she was dying. I drove home that night, and for the first time in years, I let myself feel something other than quiet acceptance. I felt something closer to clarity. If you've ever had something that was rightfully yours quietly given to someone else, like this video before we continue. For the first few months after Christmas, I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a ring. Sentimental value, sure, but not worth damaging family relationships over. I almost believed that. Then, 6 months later, Haley posted a photo online, a close-up of her engagement ring resting beside my grandmother's ring, now reset as a wedding band, captioned, "2 rings, 2 generations of love in this family." Something about seeing it photographed like that, repurposed, recontextualized as her family heirloom, made the quiet acceptance crack. I called my father. "I saw Haley's post," I said, keeping my voice level. "The ring is being reset?" "Oh," he said, sounding caught off guard. "Yes, she wanted to incorporate it into her wedding band." "Isn't that sweet?" Dad, I said. Grandma gave me that ring. She told me herself, before she died, that it was mine. There was a pause. Olivia, honey, I know you were close to her, but Haley's always been more sentimental about these things. You've never really been the jewelry type. I thought it made more sense for her to have it. That's not your decision to make, I said quietly. It was never yours to give away. It was mine. Don't make this ugly, he said. It's just a ring. I didn't argue further. I hung up and sat with the conversation for a long time. It's just a ring, he'd said. But it wasn't, not really. It was the last physical piece of the one person in that family who had ever made me fade or fully seen. I decided, that week, to find out exactly what I was dealing with. I called a jeweler recommended by a friend and described the ring in detail, the antique setting, the diamond cluster, the approximate age based on family history. The jeweler asked me to send photos. I found some old ones from my grandmother's belongings, taken years earlier for insurance purposes, still saved on an old hard drive. 2 days later, the jeweler called back. Based on these photos, she said, if this is what I think it is, an early 1960s piece with this particular diamond cut and this gold purity, you could be looking at a ring worth somewhere between $75,000 and $85,000. I sat in silence for a moment, phone pressed to my ear. $80,000. Given away at a Christmas dinner, in a velvet box, because Haley was more sentimental. I didn't call my father back immediately. Instead, I did something quieter, more deliberate. I found the old insurance documents my grandmother had kept, the ones listing the ring's appraised value from over a decade earlier, along with a handwritten note in her own writing, for Olivia, my mother's ring, then mine, now hers. I had documentation. I had her own words, in her own handwriting. I didn't want to destroy my family over this. But I also wasn't going to let this disappear quietly, the way so many other things had disappeared quietly over the years. I made a decision. I would handle this calmly, deliberately, and completely on my own terms, not with anger, but with undeniable proof. If this part is making your blood boil a little, drop a like, it helps. I requested a family meeting, my father, Denise, and Haley, before the wedding, at my father's house. I brought a folder. Inside were copies of the appraisal documents, my grandmother's handwritten note, and the jeweler's estimated valuation. I want to talk about the ring, I said, setting the folder on the table. My father sighed. Olivia, please, not before the wedding. This is exactly the time to talk about it, I said, before it's permanently reset and impossible to undo. I slid the folder across the table. Denise opened it first, scanning the documents, her face changing slowly as she read. Grandma left written instructions, I said. In her own handwriting. The ring was appraised years ago at close to $80,000. This wasn't a small sentimental piece, Dad. This was a significant asset, and it was explicitly designated for me. Haley's face went pale. I didn't know it was worth that much. I didn't know there was anything written down. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. Haley hadn't orchestrated this. She'd simply accepted what was handed to her, the same way she'd accepted most things in that house her whole life. I turned to my father. You knew. You knew what she told me. You knew what she wrote down. And you gave it away anyway, because it was easier than having an uncomfortable conversation with me. He didn't deny it. He just sat there, silent, staring at the folder. I'm not asking for the ring back exactly as it was, I said. I understand it's already been altered for the wedding. But I am asking for what it's actually worth, $80,000, fairly divided or reimbursed, because that was never yours to give away in the first place. The room was tense for a long moment. Denise, to her credit, spoke first. She's right, she said quietly, looking at my father. This isn't fair, and it isn't legal, honestly, if there were written instructions. Eventually, after weeks of uncomfortable conversations, my father agreed to a settlement, not the full ring, since it was already altered, but a fair financial equivalent, funded partly by refinancing part of his own assets. $40,000, with the remainder acknowledged as a future inheritance adjustment in his will. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Family relationships remained strained for a while. But it was fair, finally, after years of quiet imbalance. Haley and I talked honestly for the first time in years, without our parents in the room. She admitted she'd always known, on some level, that things had been unequal growing up, but she'd never had the language or the courage to say anything about it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have asked more questions when he gave it to me." "You were a product of the same system I was," I said. "I don't blame you for accepting what was handed to you. I blame the person who handed it. We didn't become best friends overnight. But something honest opened up between us that hadn't been there before. Here is what I want you to take from this: if you've ever had something quietly taken from you and handed to someone else, wrapped in a reason that sounded almost reasonable. Sentimental value is not a legal argument. She's more sentimental is not the same as, it was hers to give. If something was explicitly promised to you, in writing or in someone's dying wish, you are allowed to ask for what is rightfully yours, calmly, with proof, without apology. You don't have to accept quiet unfairness just to keep the peace. Sometimes keeping the peace has cost you more than you realize, for far longer than you realize. Ask the uncomfortable questions. Get the documentation. And know that standing up for what's rightfully yours is not the same as being ungrateful, or difficult, or dramatic. It's simply being honest, with your family, and with yourself.